my sisters and my brothers and everyone else. Let's just go ahead and publicly acknowledge this little monstrosity. I apologize for, not really. Quarantine calls for desperate measures. Um, Consider it like Frankenstein, perhaps. It's a monstrosity that has been birthed, and who knows what it'll do at this point. It's not in my control anymore. So we'll see what happens up here. Um, anyway, best way to, I think, kind of wrap up Leaf by Niggle. Well, not quite wrap up because we'll do one more quick snippet tomorrow with the two ending scenes that Tolkien tacked on at the end of the story. But this is the ending of the main narrative, and I think the best way to maybe progress through that is to just kind of follow the story. And I'm going to point out just a couple things that stood out to me, some quotes that caught my attention, and we'll just kind of riff on those and see where we go. So the first thing that I think really stands out in yesterday's reading is the tension between art and law, right? If we use those two words to represent law, representing sort of the daily things that we have to do, the laws of life, right? So in this story, they're actually the laws of the country in many ways. But we can consider them as the laws of life, right? And there's a lot of those things, grocery shop so that you have food. Take care of yourself, which means do laundry, right? All the different things. For you guys as students, do homework, right? So that you can hopefully have a successful career in whatever avenue you want to pursue. It also includes things like helping your neighbors, right? Mowing the yard, just the daily necessities of life. And we see the character of Parrish really representing that. He doesn't really care about art. He looks at Niggle's painting and he's like, why would you do this? He even asks Niggle, right, if he can have part of his canvas to help patch his roof, right? So he's very practical. He's very matter of fact. He's very focused on the day-to-day operations. And then we have, on the other end of the spectrum, we have Niggle, who represents more of an artistic perspective of life. In his case, it's literal art, right? So he has this big picture, the Zeinzucht, right? He glimpses the backcountry and he's trying to catch glimpses of it through his art, but he can't necessarily do it. He's a daydreamer. He has these grand aspirations for this incredible portrait, this incredible canvas that he wants to do. And he tends to neglect some of the laws of life, the things that Parrish really focuses on, in order to spend more time with his art. And the common theme that's running through all of these is time, right? There's not enough time to do both of them successfully, fully successfully. And so Niggle, he'll get a leaf done, and then Parrish will interrupt him, and then a neighbor will come knocking, and he'll have to do this, and he feels that tension, and eventually he runs out of time, and he has to go on this long journey, which is the journey that we all have to take, and it's the journey of death. And I really like this picture because I think it does a great job of representing the tension that we all feel ourselves in, which is the struggle between the things that we want to do and the things that we need to do, and there not being enough time to do them both fully and completely. We have these desires, these grand life aspirations, and we have homework. We have these art projects or these projects, whatever you dream of doing. And then you have the reality that maybe one day you want to have a family, and maybe you can't do your dreams and your family at the same time. And eventually you can't put off the journey forever. And I like when the coachman arrives, or the porter, and he says that. He's like, all right, Niggle, it's time to go. And Niggle's like, well, I didn't finish it. He's like, well, it's time to go. Right? It's done as far as you're concerned. And so we see Niggle, he's frustrated, he arrives, he gets on the train, right, taking him through it's the passage of death, and he arrives in this purgatory, this in-between stage. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time, I'm not very qualified to give a full biblical exegesis of purgatory and what that looks like according to the different faith traditions. I personally don't think there's a whole lot of merit for it. Tolkien obviously thought differently, and a lot of other people, intelligent people, think on both ends of the spectrum. Um, but regardless, in this story, he arrives at some sort of in between. And there's this really interesting conversation between these two voices. And if we're going to see it as a one-to-one allegory, I think the best way to see that would be the first voice being the voice of justice, or God the Father, right, who demands justice. The second voice being the voice of mercy, right, which is God the Son, or Jesus, the sacrificial lamb. Um, if we're not going to see it as directly one-to-one, because Tolkien does not always do it in that way, right? It's still meant to be seen as a voice of justice and a voice of mercy in some regards. Um, Niggle arrives, and he wakes up, and he hears these voices outside, and they're discussing. And the second voice says, they're talking about, should we let him in? Should we let him into the pearly gates? And the second voice says, well, let's look at the records, right? Let's look at what he's done. And we talked about this in Ecclesiastes. At the very end, it says, God takes account of all the things that we've done, which can be a really scary thought if it weren't for the work of Jesus, right? And so the second voice, the voice of mercy, says, let's look at the records. Should we let Niggle in? And the first voice says it pretty plainly. He goes, well, he never got ready for his journey, right? He left his jobs undone. There were so many things that he just didn't complete. He wasn't really planning for death. So no, I don't really think we should let him in. And then he also says he should not have neglected so many of his duties. Right? That's a great line. He shouldn't have neglected so many of the things he had to do. Right? He was so focused on this art that he was neglecting some of the things that he just should have done. And then the second voice comes in, right? The Jesus figure, the mercy figure, intervening on behalf of Niggle. He says, still, there is this last report, that wet bicycle ride. It seems plain that this was a genuine sacrifice. And he's referring to the part where Parrish needed help. Parrish couldn't go because he was lame in his leg. And Niggle said, okay, I'm going to put up my art for a second. I'm mad about it. I'm not happy, but I'm going to put up my art for a second. I'm going to go to help my neighbor. Didn't do it with the best heart intentions, but he did it. And then the first voice says and concludes, and this is a really beautiful line. The first voice says, I think you put it too strongly, essentially saying, I don't think we should let him in based off of his merits, but you have the last word. And what a beautiful picture of the gospel there, right? That God the Father saying, based off of the things that Niggle has done in and of himself, I don't think we should let him in. But hey, Jesus, you got the last word, right? You're the one who's paid that sacrifice. So you decide. The second voice, as we know, decides that Niggle's heart intentions were in the right place, even if his works weren't necessarily up to par, and decides to let him in. And then we get to Niggle arriving in the backcountry. Remember, the Zeinzucht is that longing to fully arrive. It's the longing to not just get glimpses of something more, but to see it in full. And we get, I picked out what I think are some of the three most beautiful quotes from his arrival. He talks about the grass. It was green and close, and yet he could see every blade distinctly. He seemed to remember having seen or dreamed of that sweep of grass somewhere or other. Right? And so all of a sudden, Niggle, all the glimpses that he's had in this earthly life of heaven or of something more, he now sees it in full. And he can see it distinctly. It's not through a mist anymore, right? It's not dimly. It's not a glimpse. He sees it. And he's like, whoa, right? Takes his breath away. And then he sees his tree, right? Before him stood the tree, his tree, finished, its branches growing and bending in the wind, that Niggle had so often guessed and had so often failed to catch. And so he sees this grand vision of what he had been trying to paint in his portrait, right? When we try and imagine what life would be like just whole with that missing puzzle piece filled in, Niggle could only see a leaf before, and now he sees the tree in full, right? He's like, there it is. I see it, right? I'm complete. And then he walks into the backcountry, and it says he had never been able to walk into the distance without turning it into mere surroundings, right? So on this side of eternity, That's the Sehnsucht. It's the approaching, but every time we get close, the indescribable longing for what the heart knows not what, is what C.S. Lewis said. As we approach that longing, as we approach that satisfaction, it evades us a little bit. It evades us. And finally, Niggle arrives. He had never been able to walk into the distance without turning it into mere surroundings. And finally, he's able to enter the back of the picture. He's able to enter the back country. And to go back to the George MacDonald quote, for every key, there is a lock. Right? That's a my paraphrase of his quote, but it's in The Golden Key, one of his short stories. And he says, if there's a key, there has to be a lock. And it's that quote that we talked about with C.S. Lewis. If I find within myself a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. So if I find within myself the desire for the backcountry, but nothing I do on this side of eternity is filling that, then the most probable explanation is that there is a backcountry that we were made for. And Niggle finally gets to arrive in that backcountry in this scene. And it's a really beautiful arrival. And then lastly, Paris arrives. So it was time for Paris's journey. We don't know what the rest of his life looked like. We don't know how long Niggle was there. We can presume it was a long time, and it says he was very content with his work. But Paris finally takes his journey to death, and they spend some time in this heaven, purgatory area. It's not deep heaven, because they talk about there's a further stage, right? The mountains. And so this is where Tolkien and I might, I'm not sure I completely see eye to eye with him on this. But in this shallow heaven, if you will, or this purgatory, this right at the entrance to the gates, Niggle and Paris begin to work, and we see that the kingdom of God needs both Niggles and Parishes, right? It needs both the people that dream and aspire to create art and daydream, the people that sit and stare out the window. It also needs Parishes, right? The people that get their work done, that take care of the things that need to be taken care of, that go get groceries, that do laundry, right? That don't have time for those things because they're taking care of what needs to be taken care of. And it's interesting because we get to see that Paris begins to cultivate his appreciation for art, the other side, while Niggle begins to see that there was real value in what Paris had been doing. And I think that's just a really beautiful picture, right? That both of them are good. That if all this talk about the Sehnsucht, if you're a student who's like, I have no idea what he's talking about, like whatever Mr. Harvey's saying about Sehnsucht, right? It's not hitting me. It's not hitting me at all, intellectually or spiritually. And you may fall more on that Paris spectrum if you're like, I got homework to do, Mr. Harvey. Let's get this baby over with. There's beauty in that, right? And there's purpose in that. And for those of you that always turn in your assignments late because you're sitting there daydreaming about other things like I do, there's beauty in that, right? And the kingdom of heaven needs both of them. And it ends, well, not the actual story, but I'm going to end this with a great quote from Niggle. He says, things might have been different, but they could not have been better. Right? And that's where Niggle is finally submitting to, hey, God had the full picture all along. Right? All I could see was that little leaf. All that Paris could see was that his roof needed to be fixed. But God understood the full picture. Things might have been different, but they could not have been better. Right? Things were planned and were enacted out exactly how they were supposed to be acted out. And so to go back to the verse that I referenced in our Google Meet this morning, 1 Corinthians 13:12 says, for now we see in a mirror as though dimly, but then we shall see clearly. Now we see in part, then we shall see in full. Right? Or now we know in part, then we shall know in full, just as we are fully known. Sorry, I tripped up on the wording. But this picture of life on earth versus life in heaven, there's a lot of beauty there, right? That we see in glimpses right now. We can't fully escape the cave to get back to Plato, right? We can get closer, or we can't fully get out. But for every key, there is a lock, right? When you feel that desire, there is a fulfillment for that desire that one day we will see in full. So we'll wrap up Leaf by Niggle tomorrow. We'll move on to the Great Divorce, and it will be beautiful. So much love to all of my peoples.